for decades. Local churches and pastors have worked to develop systems and strategies to try to track effectiveness in what they're doing in their ministry, to measure the health of their ministry, and to try to figure out the things that God has really put in their heart to do. Are they really being done? Well, back in 2020, as the pandemic hit, everything changed. And even for pastors and churches to try to figure out, how do we assess, are we seeing God do what we really believe he would want to do in the life of our church and in our lives personally as pastors and leaders? The needs of the church certainly changed, and the challenges to leaders changed substantially. And now that we're kind of coming on the other end of that, it really raises the question, how do we look at ministry effectiveness today as leaders? How should we address those questions, and how should we measure church health and ministry effectiveness to ensure that pastors and churches are really flourishing and leaders are flourishing in what they're doing? Well, I'm thrilled today to be joined by Tom Nelson, my friend and the pastor of Christ Community Church in the Kansas City area, and one of the founders of Made to Flourish, just an incredible organization that's blessing pastors in the church and people in congregations all across the United States. Tom, welcome. So glad to have you here with me to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. And Kevin, I just appreciate your friendship and your leadership. So thank you for giving me this privilege.
You're welcome. It's great to have the opportunity to talk with you about something that I know matters to both of us. And as we look back, I mean, historically, how have you seen churches measure ministry effectiveness in your time in pastoral ministry?
Well, I think we often, think of, let's just use the 5 B's. I mean, I think historically there was a sense, right, of baptisms. I mean, right, there was some sense of conversion, so baptisms. And then I think throughout church history also there's been, the quantitative measurements of the other B's. We talk about, let's use the language, bodies, buildings, bucks, but also increasingly in an internet age, brand. And all those 5, I think, are often quantitative measures. The challenges of that are multiple challenges with that. I think it's well intended. I think it has some merit and some value, but most of those measurements, as you know, Kevin, are really focused on how well we do Sunday, not as much how we evaluate how well God's people are doing on Monday. So I have a little bit more of a reflection on that area, but Sunday does matter, our programming, our attendance,
sure.
That does all matter, but I think sometimes we maybe get a little bit out of whack on that. But
well, I have a good friend in Nairobi, Kenya, from my days working in Reach Global in Africa, who used to talk about what he called the Sunday church gathered for teaching, instruction, and fellowship, and the Monday church, which was scattered all over the community for service and ministry.
Yes.
And it's trying to make sure that we're touching both of them.
Yeah.
To be able to make that happen. Now, as you think about churches and churches today, I mean, why would churches want to take a bit of a different approach in what they measure and what they're looking for?
Well, I think let's just use those 5 B's, especially the bodies, buildings, bucks. And again, institutions matter. So I think part of our evaluation is not only the health of individuals, but institutions. Someone really smart a long time ago said, without individuals, nothing ever changes. Without institutions, nothing ever endures. And the church is both. I mean, church is an organic reality, right? It's a spiritually empowered reality, but also an institution. Jesus uses metaphors of institutions. So I think evaluation is always a challenge. We don't always know the quantitative or qualitative, but I do think we should look at evaluation a bit differently. So one, I do think we should seek to figure out how individuals are being transformed, coming to faith and being transformed in Christ likeness, the best we can tell. And I think there are ways we can do better on that, especially in terms of equipping them for their Monday world. But also institutions, church is an institution, whether it's large or small, it has institutional aspects that give it continuity, and that's the place where a lot of organic change can take place. So I'm just saying, I think some of our measurements need to take account of individual growth, but also institutional health.
Well, and some of the things, I mean, I look back to my days in pastoral ministry as well. There are the hard measures, the things that are easy to count. I mean, how many people showed up on Sunday?
Right.
You know what your offerings were.
Yep. Number of givers.
You can count the programs. Those are all things you can count. I think there's some of the more sort of soft measures In other words, it's true transformation in people's lives. Are people living more obediently to Christ? Are they flourishing in their own lives, in their souls? Is there a sense of it's well with their soul? Those are some of the aspects that I think are more difficult to try to measure, to try to wrap your arms around. And I'm wondering, how have you seen some different approaches to try to even think about ministry effectiveness and how to understand whether we're really getting there or not?
Yeah, again, I look through a mirror dimly, and I don't know if I have any great wisdom to share, but I do think we have a paradigm problem of focusing on Sunday measurements and not on Monday. I'm just going to go back to that. And we often miss a shepherding paradigm. Like even the shepherd, think about ancient Middle East, had a good idea, the number of sheep, but also the quality and care of them, how they were doing on a qualitative level. They were in touch with the sheep. So if you serve a congregation of 30, 40 people, which is a wonderful privilege, right, you probably can do that by art. You probably are observing, you know their life, you can see how they're doing in their marriage and their work. You get a little larger, how do you supervise? How do you equip? How do you assess how your sheep are doing? You don't even know where they are on Monday or the majority of their life. So, I think made the first example, we are working on different mapping skills. We have a new tool that is a skill mapping tool that allows pastors and churches to get a good sense of who's there, what are their gifts, where do they spend their time, and then how do we shepherd them? How do we know who our flock is, how the sheep are doing? How do we help equip them where they're called the majority of their days? So I'm just saying we are at Made to Flourish right now have a new skill mapping tool that really helps congregations and leaders get a sense of where people are, where God has gifted them, where their heart is, and then how do we equip them where God has already deployed them. So there are some tools we're developing, but I just want to say, I think we're thinking critical. For example, and different of your listeners have different contexts, culturally, size, that kind of thing. But in leadership, how do you assess how people are doing? Well, one of the things that we do at Christ Community is we, as a team, we're looking at number of hospital visits, right, or personal visits. We also look at consistency of workplace visits. This is really transformational in assessing how well our staff are doing in equipping people where they spend the majority of their life. So one of the things is maybe not your typical measurement is we look, of course, at number of people in small groups and engagement, things like that, but also workplace visits. And workplace visits really allow pastors and leaders to get a good sense of how people are being disciples in their place of work. And that information is collected and it's certainly informed. I'm just saying it informs preaching. If we know we have 100 educators, certain times we highlight that. So we can talk more about that, Kevin. But I think the biggest thing I want to share is that how we assess what we assess, is it primarily Sunday or that gathered space? Again, that's important. Or the institutional health, but also are we really getting a sense of how we're discipling people in their everyday life? And so that's a little more messy, a little less quantitative, but it needs more of our attention. So that's what we're trying to develop and work as one little church in Kansas City.
Well, I think what you're saying, Tom, makes tremendous sense to me, because when you think about the fact that where do people live the majority of their lives? They don't live it inside the physical facility of our church. Yes. They live it at their workplace. They live it in their home, their neighborhood, and in the relationships they have. And so it's finding ways to be able to get an understanding of how are they doing in those various areas. In the time when I was a pastor too, I used to love going to visit people in their workplace. Yeah. Could we meet for lunch? Let me stop at your office. I'd love to see what you do. And there's a sense of, I think, joy of people sharing that with those that they know, but also, wow, I understood a lot more about what the needs were, the opportunities were, and what we were seeing happening in their lives by doing that. So it's again being with people in their world, not expecting everything that they do to come to our world, in a sense, in the church.
Well, Kevin, I commend you because, for me, many years, I missed that. In my early pastoral work, I was so focused on how well I did on Sunday. And again, I'm not diminishing the importance of the gathered space. That's a big part, but I had no understanding of why that was important or consistency or how to measure that. And I didn't really know how the sheep God had entrusted me were really doing in their everyday life. So for 20 years or so, we've been working really hard to try to be more consistent in that as a local church. And we were talking about assessment, but let me just say, behind this assessment and passions, are we a church for Monday? And we use this language, again, not to diminish the gathered space. All of us are to serve and do well Sunday. But really, we're to equip the saints for the works of service in their world, right? That's this Ephesians, for their marriage, their work. That's what the whole book is about, the church. So I'm just saying, I think we need to think carefully as leaders about our understanding of our primary missions on Monday. Here's why. We talk a lot about it, maybe the first one places, the Sunday to Monday gap. And again, as a pastor, Kevin, you didn't have that big a gap because you saw the need for that. But so many of us miss the sense that there's at least 5 compelling things at stake if we are assessing just Sunday, how well we do on Sunday. Again, that's important. I don't want to minimize that. But the equipping service and what we're going to stand before God is not just how well we do on Sunday, it's how well God's people are becoming spiritually mature and on mission on Monday. There are 5 things at stake, Kevin. If we have a Sunday to Monday gap, if we're not equipping and assessing people in their Monday world, then the worship of God is at stake, because the primary place of worship is where they work or where they play. It's not Sunday. Again, not to diminish corporate worship and the beauty of that, but the primary place of worship is Monday, not Sunday. Secondly, their spiritual formation takes place throughout the week, not just in a Sunday Bible study or a Sunday. Again, that's important, but the primary place we're formed in Christ likeness or not is in our daily life. So how do we know? How do we equip people in their worshipful life, their intimacy with God, their spiritual formation? Gospel plausibility and gospel proclamation, Kevin, are also part of that, because most people who don't know Christ yet, and this should move our hearts, right? We're evangelical. We care for people's eternal destiny, will not walk into the church on Sunday as much as we want them to do it, right? But
Absolutely.
God's people are equipped and sent everywhere around people who don't know Christ to be salt and light, but to be gospel plausibility structures and gospel proclaimers. So how are we evaluating even evangelism? How are we evaluating people coming to faith? Is it primarily equipping people to share their faith in their daily life and to live their life? And then again, the common goods at stake. So I'm just pretty big on that, Kevin, but I think we talk about assessment, but it's what are we assessing and why? And how do we know how the sheep are doing?
Well, and even the question I think that raises, Tom, is some new approaches to thinking about what we measure, what we're looking at, what you're talking about, sort of a both and.
Yes.
Right. We need to measure what goes on Sunday when we gather together, but there's also then the rest of the week, and it's the both and. So some of those new approaches, looking at what we measure, I mean, how have you seen that impact the health of the church and health of individuals? I know, you've written in your book, Flourishing Pastors, which I love the book, by the way. It's a great read. And you talk in there about a scorecard and thinking about that, and then just the impact of that. If you're counting, if you're sort of measuring the right things, you're looking at the right things, how does that impact the health of the church?
Well, it matters a lot. And again, we do, I don't want to miss it. Our scorecard does include, the more quantitative measures of consistent financial giving, financial health. I'm not minimizing it. When people give, that's a measure of their discipleship or their attendance and serving. I call it doing the chores of the family church. I mean, they're serving, but I think that misses some things. So what we're doing in our little context is we're asking questions as a leadership team, and we're trying to create ways of assessing this. And again, some of it's in art, some of it's more strategic in surveys and evaluations. As you get a little larger, it requires more technology and more work, but there's several things. One is our congregations, our congregation members being loved well. And again, this is not only important as Christians, but this is a vital part of our witness, right? By this will all people know you're his disciples by your love for one another. And there are ways to assess that in terms of interacting with new people, watching, observing how small groups really care for each other or not when you have a meltdown. So we ask the question in the evaluation review, are our congregation being loved well? Secondly, are the vulnerable being cared for well? That can be widows, orphans, that can be people in our community, but there are tangible ways to assess that. In terms of giving, we have a thing called the Orphan Care Portal. There's just a lot of ways we can assess. Are we being that caring family with those who are vulnerable in our own congregation, but in our community? And we can evaluate that actually pretty well. The number of dollars, the number of hours of volunteer service. We have, again, this wonderful technology that connects social service needs with people's giving. And someone has a need in our community, single mom for a car, There are people in our congregation because of technology that know about that and give that money anonymously, right? So, I mean, there are things like that. Our congregation being equipped for all of life. That's what our elders ask. How are we doing on equipping people for Monday? So I've already talked about that. Another one is our leaders being multiplied and deepened. What's our bench? What's our pipeline? So that's another thing at Christ Community we do a lot, Kevin. You know, we have a residency, we have a lot of institutional structures where we have intentional pathways of leadership development. And we keep asking, are leaders deepening in their own intimacy with Christ and in their own skills, but are more leaders being multiplied to move our mission forward in every dimension of life for the church and for the world? So that's another thing we can actually measure. Like I can give you one example also, everybody. Like we're like a teaching hospital at Christ Community. I think you know that, Kevin, that we have a residency program, and this is for the leaders for the church, not just for the world. But like when pastors who are in training finish their MDiv, and most of them, almost all right now, are Trinity, because we're E3 guys, but we love Trinity. Several of them spend 2 years of an immersion with us, and we always have residents with us. So we can give you a 20-year snapshot of a leadership pipeline, not only for us, an expansion and succession, but for the kingdom. So we can evaluate how are we doing in leadership development, small group leaders. We do that in different contexts for vocational leadership, but we can actually assess with some quantitative and qualitative measurements. How are we doing? Are we recruiting the best people? Are they immersed well in transformation? Are we sending them out? So these are the things maybe at least we're humbly and not perfectly doing in our context to try to get a sense. Are we being fruitful? Are we on mission? Are we honoring God?
Tom, that's so helpful as you think and to hear what you're doing. It really is significant. I think that there's a couple of questions that come out of that for me. Sure. I mean, obviously churches come in all sizes and shapes in different communities. How would you see this looking different? Smaller churches, larger churches, as you in your church, but also through Made to Flourish. Sure. What are the impacts there?
Yeah, and again, I don't claim to be an expert. I have had the joy of being a part of a church that was 2 people and now much larger. So, again, not that that's better. It's not better, okay? But I've had some experience in 30-some years in pastoral work, that's why I have gray hair, of different stages of size and different cultural contexts. So all those matter, and they have to be contextualized. But I would say is that the principles of this, of what we're about missionally, where our intentionality is, where our assessment is of how we're doing in fruitfulness and faithfulness, right, is really the principles are the same. The difference is in a smaller context, like think of a shepherd, smaller context of a smaller flock is not less important, or it's very important, right? But it's more of an art because you are in contact eye with people, right? I mean, you don't have to have other systems and structures and leaders and technology to get an assessment of how people are doing and how we help equip them. So I would just say, as an institution gets larger, there are more layers of complexity, more people doing it, more under shepherds, and there's more technology that helps us with the art of observation and care. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Or scale.
It does. I mean, I even think back in my own pastoral ministry from my early days in a small church. It was much easier to know where people were and to even visit them in their workplace.
And for them to have access to you, Kevin. Like, I mean, they have coffee with everybody almost.
Right, right. You get to a larger setting, it becomes more difficult. Yes. But I go back to a comment that our mutual friend Larry Osborne has said often, and that is, as churches get larger, they need to get smaller. You need to kind of figure out how do you continue to have those connections. And so there are certainly tools that are available. Some of it is just being intentional of thinking of what those look like.
I think it is a shepherding mindset. I mean, again, we have all different leadership gifts, but that everyone has a sense of caring for the flock, assessing how they're doing, how to equip them, but loving people at the heart of it, right? It's just more delegated out. And it's still the art of being Christ's hands and feet and heart with people, right? It's just heavy people work, regardless of your size.
It really is. No matter, boil it all down, it's about caring for people, as being hands and feet of Jesus and interacting with people. So as we think about sort of the next step related to this, I mean, I'm thinking, I'm a pastor, I'm a church leader, I'm listening to the conversation we're having. And my question would be, so how do I begin to practically integrate some of this into the life of my church and the strategy that we have? Any thoughts or wisdom you might give to how you can get started if you feel like you need to get some traction in this area?
Yeah, well, I would, again, not be a Lone Ranger. So I would, as maybe you're doing right now, you are listening to other people who are in the trenches with you and learning from them, like a teachable posture, because people are wrestling with this in different contexts, right? But I would say, first of all, going back to our original question, at least, and maybe it's out of my own experience, is that I would change some pastoral leadership practices. If you are not doing this, it will be absolutely life-changing. If you are not consistently having workplace visits with your people, with God's people, where they live, work, and play, but particularly their work, I would encourage you to begin that. Begin to initiate with leadership, and to find out what challenges they face, how they're doing in their Monday world, to enter their Monday world as a curious fellow priest, right, a believer. And I would say that, well, if you don't do that consistently, if you don't have that contact, it's going to be really hard for you to really understand people's world, meet them at their world, and disciple them for their world, not your world. So maybe many of people who are listening are not insular, they're not isolated, they're not focused in their office. What I'm saying is get out with the people God has given you, but spend some time where they spend the majority of their life. What are the challenges? What do they need from you? You're there for them, not vice versa. So, I mean, again, I'm pretty strong on that. And Kevin, it sounds like you had that practice, but I've found many, many pastors, and I was one of them. And there's reasons why you get away from these things, or your staff, but to spend time there, because I think that will help you be more of a church for Monday. And I think that's, if we go there, then you can really begin to have the ability to evaluate, are we making disciples of every nation? Are we making disciples of every socioeconomic group, of every place where God has placed them? And are we equipping them and seeing them flourish where God has called them as followers of Jesus? So that may be a broken record, but I mean, I think, again, do Sunday well. We all should do Sunday well. We should preach well, right? We should keep track of Sunday. The gather space is important. But it's, to me, the assessment's going to change. The scorecard's going to change if it's focused on how well God's people are doing on Monday and how we're equipping them, how we're encouraging them, how we're praying for them. I think that will be the biggest shift. And maybe that's very basic for some, but it's massively, it will impact the local church, the staff, if you have staff, more than anything I've ever done in all my years. It will change the scorecard.
Well, I think this is one of those things, Tom, that it sounds simple. Yeah. It's profound. When you think about engaging people where they are, listening, watching, seeing how they're doing, and it really comes down to shepherding. And I so appreciate your heart for that. And thanks for joining me today just to talk about this. And I'd encourage you folks that are watching our interview today, check out Made to Flourish as an organization, some tremendous tools and helps that are there. Tom, thanks for your leadership in launching that and the impact that is having really across the country. And then I'd encourage you to check out Tom's newest book, The Flourishing Pastor. There's some great things there. One of many books that he's written, and an opportunity for you to unpack some of these things in a little bit different way. So Tom, thanks for being with us. God bless you. And I love your heart for the church. My desire, as is yours, is that we would see churches, pastors, leaders, and the folks in our congregations flourish in their walk of faith, their love for Jesus, and the impact they would have for the gospel in communities where they work, live, and play, as well as seeing their churches when we're gathered on Sundays be vibrant, exciting places for the gospel.
Amen. And thank you, Kevin, for your leadership. It's been great to be with you.
God bless. Thanks.